Most people think severe trauma kills with blood loss. It doesn't. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're exploring a dramatic biological chain reaction that forces us to rethink absolutely everything we know about surviving severe injury. We're going to dive deep into what's actually happening inside the human body during those critical, chaotic moments right after a major trauma.
You know, when we picture severe trauma, we almost always picture this frantic energy, right? It's a desperate, high-stakes race against time to just stop the bleeding. And we naturally assume that if a medic or a surgeon can just seal the wound and stop the leak, well, the patient's saved. It makes logical sense, but actually the truth is much darker. The real mechanism of death is quietly happening beneath the surface, completely invisible to the naked eye. It's way more complex than just losing fluids.
So, that brings us to part 1, the blood loss myth. As it turns out, controlling the bleeding is really just the beginning. It's merely step 1 in a massive, multi-stage war for the patient's life.
Okay, let's dive into this. Even if a rescuer manages to perfectly stop the bleeding with tourniquets and pressure, the patient can still slip away right in front of them. Why? Because severe blood loss acts like a biological tripwire. It sets off a catastrophic internal chain reaction. The true hidden killers aren't what you'd expect. They're cold, they're acid, and, shockingly, they involve a well-intentioned rescue mistake that almost everyone makes when they're desperately trying to save a life. Let's break down exactly how this happens.
Moving right along to part 2, the lethal triad. To really grasp this insidious internal threat, we first have to look at the historical medical model that guided emergency responders for decades. So, for years, trauma medicine described a terrifying phenomenon known as the lethal triad. The 3 core elements here are hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy. Now, it's vital to understand that these aren't just 3 separate random problems happening at the same time. They're deeply interconnected. They actually feed off each other in this vicious, deadly cycle where each individual condition makes the other 2 significantly worse. It's literally a biological downward spiral.
Let's look at how this mechanical failure builds step by step. First up, the cold comes fast. A body rapidly losing blood is rapidly losing its ability to hold heat, leading to severe hypothermia. The patient is literally freezing from the inside out. Second, the acid builds up. With less blood circulating, there's a massive drop in oxygen reaching the body's tissues. So, in a desperate bid to survive without oxygen, the body's cells are forced to switch to an emergency backup power system, what biologists call anaerobic metabolism. Now, it keeps the cells alive for a fleeting moment, but the toxic byproduct of this emergency backup is a massive buildup of lactic acid. So suddenly, the patient's blood is freezing cold and highly acidic.
And those first 2 steps inevitably trigger the third, and perhaps the most devastating, coagulopathy. Simply put, this is a condition where the blood's ability to clot is severely impaired. But why does this happen? Well, it's because the proteins and enzymes responsible for clotting are incredibly sensitive. Blood that is freezing cold and highly acidic simply cannot form stable clots. The clotting factors just physically break down. So even if a medic stopped the bleeding from the outside, internal bleeding quietly restarts because the body has completely lost its natural ability to seal its own leaks.
Which brings us to part 3, the 4th corner. You know, as science evolves, so does our understanding of how trauma actually kills. And eventually, researchers realized a massive piece of this biological puzzle was totally missing.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive paradigm shift we're undergoing in trauma care right now. For decades, that classic lethal triad was the ultimate boogeyman in emergency medicine. But it's currently being replaced by a brand new standard. Recent evidence added a 4th, absolutely crucial factor, transforming that old 3-sided triad into the lethal diamond. And honestly, this discovery changes the entire equation of how we save lives.
So what's that missing 4th corner? It's calcium. The source material puts it pretty bluntly. Calcium is not optional for clotting. It activates the very factors the clotting cascade heavily depends on. Think of it like the biological spark plug that starts the engine of your body's repair system. In cases of severe hemorrhage, patients bleed out their calcium reserves incredibly fast. They become critically low on this vital mineral super early in the trauma process, sometimes way before they're even loaded into the back of an ambulance, let alone reaching a hospital's doors.
This newly discovered 4th corner essentially acts as a massive amplifier. A lack of calcium weakens every single part of the triad at the exact same time. It severely accelerates the collapse of the patient's entire cardiovascular system, making the freezing cold, the toxic acid, and the uncontrolled bleeding infinitely more dangerous.
And that is exactly why calcium earned its rightful place as the fatal fourth corner of the lethal diamond.
This leads directly into part 4, the transfusion paradox, because understanding calcium's critical role brings us to a really chilling realization about modern emergency medicine and how we've been treating trauma patients for years.
So, the crucial point is, here is the shocking rescue mistake almost everyone makes. The treatment itself can actually deepen the problem. The terrifying paradox here is that the very act of saving a life, pumping necessary bags of stored blood and fluids into a dying patient, might unwittingly complete the lethal diamond. In an earnest attempt to pull the patient back from the brink, we might accidentally push them right over the edge.
Let me walk you through exactly how this terrifying paradox unfolds. Rescuers urgently transfuse stored blood to replace exactly what the patient just lost. Seems like the perfect solution, right? But wait, stored blood contains an additive called citrate. Now, citrate is put there for a very good reason. It keeps the blood from clotting inside the plastic bag while it sits in a fridge. But here is the fatal catch. When that citrated blood enters the bleeding patient, the citrate acts like a chemical magnet. It actively seeks out and binds directly to whatever calcium the patient has left, stripping it right out of their system. So the patient's calcium levels drop to critical, fatal lows. Their entire clotting cascade completely fails, and the resuscitation effort itself actually completes the very diamond it was so desperately trying to prevent. Moving to part 5, surviving the diamond. So now that we understand the full, terrifying picture of this internal biological collapse, how on earth do trauma patients actually survive this?
Well, based on the latest evidence compiled by Austere Medicine, the new standard of care is brilliantly clear and highly actionable. First, keep them warm. You have to aggressively fight that hypothermia right from the start just to protect those fragile clotting enzymes. Second, restore perfusion. This is really just the medical way of saying you need to get oxygenated blood flowing back into the patient's tissues to stop that dangerous buildup of lactic acid. And finally, the most critical, life-saving update to the trauma formula, you absolutely must give the patient extra calcium. Literally, if you replace the blood, you have to replace the calcium.
Now please remember, the concepts we've discussed today are strictly for educational and informational purposes, just to help us all better understand the fascinating science of survival. This isn't medical advice, a diagnosis, or a substitute for formal clinical training. In any real-world emergency situation, always contact your local emergency services immediately and rely on trained professionals. We've seen today how a classic triad evolved into a deadly diamond, and how a seemingly life-saving blood transfusion can secretly steal the very mineral a patient desperately needs to survive. As medical science keeps evolving and uncovering these hidden biological mechanisms, it forces us to ask one final question. Are our most trusted medical interventions hiding other fatal flaws we just haven't discovered yet? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious and always keep questioning the science.